This one has been a long time coming. Long before I ever started my YouTube career, I had this idea. To rank the various D&D classes and the characters that make up their illustrious ranks. Partially born from my love of D&D and as somewhat of an homage to two other creators that inspired me to start making videos myself. The Green Scorpion and Josh Scorcher. If you somehow don't know who either of them are and yet are watching one of my videos, then some kind of affront to reality has happened. Both are longtime Countdown creators who I have watched for years and hold immense respect for. Green Scorpion's extensive breakdowns and analyses of not only the topics he's covering, but how those topics relate to each entry in exact detail, result in enjoyable videos that I barely realize are quite regularly very long. And Josh Scorcher, the Fiery Joker, Firebrand, whatever title you know him by, has been an even bigger inspiration for his humor, earnest approach to video making, and love of storytelling in a different way. See, I do love me some D&D, but it was actually his Brony D&D campaign that first got me into D&D at all, and for better or worse, I've been tumbling down that rabbit hole ever since. And in case you're wondering, I thought up the Hearth Guy persona independent of Firebrand. I swear, it's just a coincidence. I met some longtime friends due to the D&D I was introduced to through Josh Scorcher, and I became acquainted with game franchises I may never have tried otherwise through Green Scorpion. So, in a nod to them and with my own personal flair, I wanted to make a series of countdowns that I could truly focus on. I considered doing an elements-based countdown, something both of them have done, but besides struggling to figure out how I wanted to format that, I felt like I'd just be plagiarizing their work. So I chose to go with something else. Just as the Fiery Joker got me into D&D and Green Scorpion has a series of videos covering various character or class archetypes, such as ninjas, pirates, and the like, I've decided to merge those ideas, tackling it in my own way on various subjects I hold near and dear to my heart, and as a way to pay respects to the ones who played a big role in inspiring me to start this whole YouTube thing. The current base 12 classes in D&D have been heavily influenced by our culture and the fantasy stories that have become more and more popular in the decades preceding it. The Ranger class is pretty much built on the archetype that is Aragorn, fighters are a dime a dozen, and bards are, well, bards. So to begin with, we'll be looking at the best representatives of the Artificer class. Artificer, whatever. So to begin with, I'll be looking at the best representatives of the Artificer class I could find, which was not that hard actually. A phrase I wish I could use for every class. Artificers are recognized by their scientific minds, pseudo-magical creations, and being one of two, count 'em, two, classes that use intelligence for, well, anything. An artificer will build their way out of any problem, whereas a barbarian will shout at the problem, a wizard will think about solving the problem, and a rogue will be the problem. However, unlike the rest, the artificer was added much later to the current roster of 5e classes, being first introduced as a concept in the Eberron setting before being formalized in later books with some updated features. For the most part, the core theme has remained the same, but as a general rule, I'll be focusing on the official version as my template. I only have one major stipulation. That is that function and form both matter here. If someone functions like an artificer, but another character does so as well and seems more like one, then they'll be higher up. Now, enough preamble, we all know what you're here for. Let's get on with the list and ranking the top 10 artificers in video games. Naturally, when considering a niche topic like artificers in video games, I had to get somewhat generous at times with what could be considered an artificer. Mechanically minded characters whose abilities border on fantastical could technically count as artificers based on the sort of vague rules about how their magic works. You'll notice this as something of a trend with later entries, but for now we're working on somewhat less fantastical and a sort of grounded world. I preface it like that because calling the Outer Worlds grounded is almost an outright lie. The Outer Worlds can be rather excessive in the campiness, for better or worse, but despite that, our first entry is perhaps one of the most grounded characters in this star system of silliness. The engineer from Edgewater, Parvati Holcomb. Born and raised in the frontier fishing town of Edgewater on Terra 2, Parvati was raised by her father, the engineer for the town cannery, and never knew her mother. Said mother wasn't allowed to keep her due to the importance of her work for the board, the multi-corporate body that rules over the Halcyon system. Instead, Parvati grew up in her father's office and learned his trade, something that was unusual for most people in the system. And it is with this knowledge that Parvati comes to our crew as the very first companion we acquire, and the only companion we have for the introductory quest line of the game. As to be expected in this sort of game, Parvati is not a traditional artificer, although she often fits that niche. She gives you a boost to engineering skills, her special move is largely support-based in that it paralyzes in a small AoE, and most of her companion perks center around giving you an edge in regards to mechanical working. She also has a handful of unique dialogue interactions that lets her perform an act of engineering that you can't, making her even more useful if your engineering stat is on the smaller side. Despite the clear mechanical talent she has, it's more than academic. She couldn't always tell you the pure math behind why and how she can get something to work, but by feel alone she can work out the kinks in a machine and get it running. While being the clear heart of the crew with the most genuine and innocent intentions and emotions, she tends to stumble over said emotions and overthink just about everything. As a combatant, Parvati is not the most stealthy or bulky, fitting more for dialogue moments than combat ones. However, should things go south, she tends to be a reliable melee fighter thanks to her special ability which I mentioned before. Though often nervous or unfocused, Parvati will almost always stand by your side, barring you committing some truly questionable actions. But if you're committed to good, then she's always got your back. Parvati is a favorite of mine, which is probably a lukewarm take, but she resonates with me personally for a number of reasons. However, as far as being a good example of an artificer, well, that's where she falls off to the bottom of the list. Because of the free-form style of character and companion building in the Outer Worlds, many of her more unique abilities are optional, which pulls away from her utility in those aforementioned fields. Still, it'd be a crime for me not to mention my go-to companion every time I want to go exploring the heavens of Halcyon.
I can call you Captain now. Ha! I got a captain.
I had an interesting dilemma while making this list. In my first iteration of it, I noticed that I put characters that I liked higher than other characters that fit the theme and aesthetic of an artificer more closely. Not to say there are any characters I dislike necessarily on this list, but this one is one that suffers from limited characterization. And that comes from the game he came from. Fire Emblem Fates and I have a rocky relationship. It was my very first Fire Emblem game and my favorite game to do challenge runs on. Gameplay-wise, many of its mechanics, like capture, and how it handles skills and classes, are some of my favorite across the series. On the other hand, its story has been rightly panned for the better part of a decade since its release, and I am liable to agree with the criticisms. Many of its characters get boiled down to basic tropes that are repeated ad nauseum through their support, since over half the cast have no relevance outside the chapter they get recruited in, which is a problem with many Fire Emblem games, but I digress. The character I've chosen for this spot does benefit from some further characterization through the main story that other characters lack, but outside of that, his frequent lack of presence across the game makes it hard to actually form an opinion on him, positive or negative. But boy does he fit the exact specifications for this list, and boy is he a fun unit! Say hello to the chief strategist of the Hoshinan army and the master of puppets, Yukimura. Strategist, general, and former student of the late King Sumeragi, Yukimura has a firmer presence in the early part of Fates' story. Acting as the right-hand man of Queen Makoto and later as the general leader of Hoshido's defense, once the story picks up, then he gets left behind fairly quickly. Although, in Revelations and Conquest, he acts as the boss of Fort Jinya in chapters 8 and 22 of the respective routes. However, most importantly, in Birthright, upon leveling up a puppet in your castle to its max, Yukimura will arrive and join as a playable unit. An interesting thing to point out is this odd dragon dog puppet thing that Yukimura is riding. This is a Karakuri, a mechanized puppet made in Japan through the 17th century and into the 19th century. While it appears that the idea for them have existed longer, it wasn't until the introduction of European clockmaking techniques that the puppets really began to develop. They served as a form of entertainment to the upper class, since they were really the only ones who could afford them. But while the real-life puppets were used for entertainment, in Fates, Yukimura has turned one into a functional mount. Although, one that seems to be a bit hard to keep still. As a late-game recruit, he doesn't have tremendous stat growths, but many of his class skills like Quick Salve, which lets him use self-healing consumables and then act again, helps to bolster his utility. Mechanists have access to Yumis and Shurikens, the latter of which causes a natural debuff upon hitting, which further makes up for his limited growths. But where he really shines is in his personal skill and the final skill of his class line. First, his personal skill, Perspicacious, look it up, grants an outright +5 to accuracy across every single unit on the same map as him. Simply deploy him and boom, everyone's accuracy is better. As for his other breakout skill, that would of course be Replicate. As the name implies, this skill allows Yukimura to create a copy that can act independently of him, and in a turn-based strategy game, having a little bit of control over the action economy is a massive advantage. There are drawbacks, as if either the clone or the original is defeated, then both leave the map, meaning that you can't just throw the clone into danger for easy damage, or else you'll kill Yukimura too. But when used properly, this skill can totally upend a chapter's difficulty. Something Yukimura does incredibly well is highlight a point that will be seen across the many characters on this list, that despite being tinkerers, mechanics, tacticians, and overall geniuses, Yukimura never abandoned emotion in the pursuit of logic. In his supports with a male Korin, he expresses as much that logic and emotion are not counteracting forces, but complementary and necessary to each other. While Fates' writing has a bad case of shotgun-style quality, at least in this case, it does wonders for Yukimura's characterization, which is startlingly absent throughout the rest of the game, which directly affects his placement here. If Yukimura had more time to shine, and in turn had more chances to explore the dichotomy of logic and emotion working in tandem, then he'd probably skyrocket to a higher placement. But for now, he'll stay at a modest but respectable number 9.
Another victory!
Discerning the exact definition of artificer was challenging. Is it just science that resembles magic? Is it magic from a scientific angle? Is it both? Is it neither? Seemingly, the class itself can't seem to decide which way it wants to go, as it leaves itself open for players to roleplay it either way. Which is great for D&D, but made identifying artificers a bit more challenging. After all, I don't want to just throw a mage in here and call them an artificer just because they use some vaguely scientific jargon to explain their special brand of bippity-boppity-boo. Luckily, Tales of Vesperia offered one character that towed the line just right, and, due to her characterization in correlation to her abilities, managed to just barely nudge out Yukimura for the 8th place spot. The prodigy of the strange, oddly science-based magic of the Tales of Vesperia, Rita Mordio. And again, before anyone says something, I classified Rita as an artificer due to the story and character going out of their way to explain a number of times the more knowledge-based nature of its magic. Add to the fact that all magic, especially Rita's, relies not only on some level of understanding of said knowledge, but also upon specific devices that channel that power, and you can see how Rita starts looking more and more like an artificer. With that out of the way, who is Rita Mordio? A famed prodigy and researcher into the crystal-like devices called Blastia, through which the magic system of their world operates, Rita is known in her home city as a bit of a Blastia fanatic, obsessively studying them in every facet, their history, their effects, all that jazz. She takes this attitude with her when she officially joins the party, in part since they need her expertise, and in part because Estelle wanted to be her friend and that was good enough for Rita. As you may have guessed, she's not exactly a social butterfly, and her prickly side is made abundantly clear early on. She repeatedly puts more stock in the value of Blastia and her research than in practical things, such as not getting herself blown up. However, Rita begins to grow beyond that through her connections with the main cast, primarily Estelle, who goes from Rita's first friend to her best friend pretty quick. But that's not to understate her connection to other characters either, in particular Yuri or Judith. Yuri and Rita act as two very grounding influences on Estelle, both of whom are close to her and make up the brunt of the more serious opinions in this group. Whereas Judith, due to her initial secret escapades to destroy Blastia, starts as a source of irritation for Rita. But as Judith's own past is revealed, Rita's growth shines through when she accepts Judith back into the party with only minimal griping. Through these connections and more, Rita opens up and has something of a subtler character arc compared to her other companions. Instead of some cinematic moment of self-realization, Rita becomes more empathetic and attached to the small family she's become a part of. But she never abandons that previous thorny attitude, which still makes an appearance regularly. Nor does she abandon her pursuit of knowledge and magic. And boy is that magic potent. Rita is a wholesale magic caster with the biggest and most destructive magical attacks in the party. It's all science as far as this setting is concerned, but these types of formulas take more after Oppenheimer than Newton. With enough TP, which is the gauge that allows for skills and spells, Rita can cover the field with an array of destruction. Naturally, Rita's kind of squishy and you don't want her going headfirst into a fight. Instead, she hangs out near the edge of the arena and launches her spells. In fact, if you primarily play as one of the fighter characters, chances are you'll barely actually see Rita in a fight. And instead, you'll see the random acts of creative violence she commits on a target from a distance. Due to her obviously being more of a mage character than technically an artificer, she's stuck here at number 8, although everything she uses to perform her magic would be what an artificer uses: formulas, special devices, and research. So while she isn't going much higher, she's got enough to keep this spot.
I didn't want to feel left out.
I was deeply unsure about where to put this next character. He fits all the right parts to be an artificer, but character-wise he doesn't really fit the archetype. Even in the story of the game he's in, he doesn't actually fit what an artificer generally is. And yet, in gameplay, he has all the abilities you'd expect from one. It was so head-scratching that I had him at number 5 in the original list above the next character. But in the end, he's fallen on a comfortable number 7. Varric never did make things straightforward. Leave it to Dragon Age to give me the most non-artificer artificer on this list. In Dragon Age, the subclass of Artificer is actually a rogue class and leans more into the idea of the Artificer's magic being a result of well-made mechanisms. The interesting thing is that Varric doesn't really fall into that category on a regular basis. Sure, he's mechanically minded enough to tinker with his signature weapon Bianca, and he has access to Artificer abilities in Dragon Age Inquisition, but spoiler, he isn't the one who made Bianca. Instead, it was made by a guy named Garov and redesigned by Bianca. Long story. Varric is the dwarf storyteller and best friend of Dragon Age 2 protagonist Hawke, as well as the narrator of Dragon Age 2. Throughout 2 and his follow-up appearance in Inquisition, Varric is the level-headed, quippy surface dwarf that hates everything dwarfy and writes steamy romance novels in his off time. Varric also maintains a wide network of spies, informants, and engineers that he uses to better House Tethras, and eventually the city of Kirkwall, which he has named Viscount of, albeit very reluctantly. When his back is against the wall, he sticks by his friends and makes sure everyone knows how stupid it is that they got into whatever world-ending mess they're dealing with. Varric is a ranged fighter, naturally, with most of his abilities surrounding strong single attacks or occasional traps to keep enemies from coming closer. In Dragon Age 2, he has multiple abilities to control the battlefield with AoE attacks, and his passive abilities usually boost set attack speed. In a similar vein, the focus ability of the Artificer class in Inquisition doubles the effect of any archery skill he uses. As an Artificer, he has things like the fallback plan, which he can use to move out of danger to a preset location, and depending on the upgrades, he can even reset all his ability cooldowns with it. Varric doesn't come across as very Artificer-like. He's smart by all means, but he's more street smart than book smart, which in its own way is rather unlike Artificers of the Dragon Age setting. Those sorts tend to be a bit out of their minds. And Varric is as level-headed as they come, laid back and suave, but still a straight man to the utter nonsense the world throws at him. And where there's a story to be told, Varric, Tethras, and Bianca will be there to tell it.
This will be, let's just call it an adventure, I guess.
We've been talking about characters that fit the themes of an Artificer, but so far only Yukimura has really been close, and we already talked about the lack of characterization there. However, what if there were a character that fit all the right marks, hit every button for one of the subclasses of Artificer, but had limited character of their own? Well, you'd have our number 6 spot, the Plague Doctor of Darkest Dungeon. For those who are wondering, yes, the Plague Doctor is indeed this far up only because of the mechanics. Well, kind of. What we do know of her character is that she is a learned, if somewhat crazy, scholar of medicine and toxicology. In fact, her predetermined name is Paracelsus, the Swiss physician who is considered the founder of toxicology. Plague doctors in real life were a subset of medical professionals that treated the bubonic plague and were hired out by cities to do so. Since a city's dedicated doctor was more likely to contract the disease, it was deemed safer to hire an outside doctor specialized in the plague. However, due to plenty of doctors fleeing from the plague, a fair amount of those that remained to be plague doctors had no medical experience whatsoever. Granted, medical science at the time still practiced bloodletting and balancing the humors, but something was usually better than nothing. This plague doctor, on the other hand, is very knowledgeable about the stuff she works with. Those things are poison, acids, and, medicine of dubious origins. One of the subclasses of the Artificer is the Alchemist, which I don't think I need to explain how the Plague Doctor matches. Specializing in debuffs and afflicting the poisonous blight effect, as well as a bit of stun and bleed, the Plague Doctor also comes equipped with abilities like Battlefield Medicine for minor healing and removal of status effects, or Emboldening Vapors to buff an ally's damage and speed. She also has camping skills to similarly heal wounds and remove diseases that normally can't be removed in the dungeon. Utility-wise, she is a heavy hitter if you want to throw her into the dungeons, but a word of caution. Unless she is in the back rows, she is liable to die real fast. A frontline fighter she clearly isn't, and some abilities stop working the closer up she is in the formation, so be careful about what kind of party you pair her up with. The Jester can pair decently well since he adds buffs and debuffs of a whole different type, as well as having ease of movement through the party, so in case the party gets shuffled, it's easier to correct. Like any class in Darkest Dungeon, she really starts to shine with proper investment and understanding of how to handle her. So keep your eyes focused on the darkness, and this doctor might just pull you out of the caverns alive.
A death by inches.
You know, the role of an Artificer is rather limited. The characters that usually fall into it aren't often leaders, and are almost always the brains. There are traits they can have beyond this, but generally you don't see the smartest guy in the room being the boss. This can likely be a result of two different tropes related to the technologically minded characters. Either they aren't emotionally intelligent, or they aren't socially intelligent. They're either stumbling over themselves and nervous to the point they can't lead, or their emotions are dulled and therefore seen as unable to lead people effectively. Both are tropes I take issue with. To start with, intelligence and mechanical handiness don't necessarily go hand in hand, at least not in the way you'd think. For instance, someone could not always be able to tell you the exact scientific reason about why a combustion engine does what it does, but they can certainly take a look at it and tell you how it does it. And being intelligent doesn't automatically deactivate someone's emotional response. Sure, those who are intelligent can and very often do look down on others or can express narcissistic tendencies, but these should not be treated as the overall truth. I discuss all of this because to talk about this next character is to immediately challenge both preconceptions, and to do so in a setting that you'd least expect it to come from. Warhammer 40k, the setting built on suffering. And within this galaxy is the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the video game centered around them. Originally engineers and scientists on the planet of Mars, when the human empire of the time collapsed and Mars was left disconnected from the galaxy, those same engineers and scientists became vital to maintaining life on the Red Planet. Over thousands of years, their role developed into a religious position of power over the populace of Mars, and they created a religion surrounding the worship of machines and their inner spirit, an omnipresent being called the Omnissiah. Tech priests that worship the Omnissiah, or the machine god, now serve as the primary manufacturers of the horrific Imperium of Man, replacing almost every part of their flesh, save for a few bits, to technically not be committing heresy by the Imperium's laws. From among these ranks, I have selected for our number 5 spot, Magos Dominus Faustinius. In Warhammer 40k Mechanicus, Faustinius is the leader of the expedition to the recently rediscovered Silva Tenebris, a world that is quickly revealed to be a Necron tomb world. As a Magos Dominus, Faustinius is in charge of the formation and battle plans of the various foot soldiers serving the Adeptus Mechanicus. In this case, he takes the reins on the expeditionary mission, as well as the enormous spaceship, the Kestis Metallicon, a type of ship so large and with so much mass that it generates their own gravity. Within this ship are countless levels of factories dedicated to the study and veneration of the machines and lost technology. Mixing science, religion, and a certain level of mysticism, the Adeptus Mechanicus aboard the Kestis Metallicon all answer to Faustinius. Faustinius himself is a rare voice of reason amongst the often conflicting and borderline insane voices of his council. While they argue about inane nonsense, Faustinius is the one making the decisions for the Mechanicus troops he commands, and unlike them, he does so with an understanding of his responsibility. Faustinius, unlike many Mechanicus, has not removed his ability to feel emotions. Instead, he has segmented that part of his brain so that he can choose to feel said emotions when he wants to. And it's not always positive emotions either. He chooses to feel frustration at his council's bickering. He chooses to feel grief over the idea that any tech priest treats their soldiers as expendable. And he chooses to feel confusion when things don't make sense. Not to say he's a cuddly sort either. He fully understands that the mission supersedes the importance of any lives lost. He's just as cold and calculating as any Adeptus Mechanicus should be. It's just that he also knows the value of emotions in his plans. This backs up what has been a theme of this list, the understanding for the necessity of emotion paired with logic. And as far as that theme goes, Faustinius more directly addresses it. He sees that he can't be ruled by emotion, but also understands the value in it. And while he is far up on his battleship, never directly in combat, he understands the risks his soldiers go through in his service, and chooses not to treat them like pawns. However, it's due to him being away from combat and rarely showing off his personal skills that he's stuck at number 5. It's true that you, and by extension he, is responsible for every upgrade and special tactical ability used in Mechanicus, but most of his time is spent sitting in his command chair. As a Magos Dominus, a title which denotes his understanding of warfare and combat, it can be assumed that he's more than capable of throwing down if he has to. But he's the commander, not a soldier, and so said abilities are not given a chance to be shown off. Regardless, Faustinius serves as the best of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and a rare glimmer of reason in the maddening universe he calls home. Now if only Warhammer 40k could stop burning itself to the ground.
Even in death, I serve the Omnissiah.
For how softcore cyberpunk Xenoblade actually is, I had some trouble pinning down an artificer from this franchise, mostly because I refused to select Tora. Look, I know he has some redeemable qualities, but he's too much of a coin flip as a character for me to consider him. There is Valdi, who is called Artificer whenever he is fought, and he deals heavily with machines as a character, but many of his abilities are more just generally healing, and he loses the Artificer title as his class is called War Medic, which is definitely more accurate. There was also Nickel from Xenoblade 3's Future Redeemed DLC, who was so close to being on this list. So much so that I had an entire segment written and recorded, when I suddenly recalled a character that I never should have forgotten. A character who, once I remembered him, caused a reshuffling of this entire list as he blew past all prior entries. The lord over not just machines, but an entire world of machines. The sole master of Mechonis, Egil. Despite all we've covered, we've yet to see a villainous artificer. Yukimura can be your enemy, and Faustinius isn't always the kindest person, but neither are what I'd classify as villains. But Egil? He's the primary driving force for most of Xenoblade Chronicles' first game. Eons ago, the ancient titans called the Mechonis and Bionis battled viciously until both lay dead. As the centuries passed, life began to spread across both. Organic life on Bionis, and synthetic life on Mechonis. However, as we learn through the course of the game, both the Mechonis and Bionis have souls, and both have a very different way of treating their children. The spirit of the Bionis, Zanza, created life on Bionis in order to have companionship, but maintained control over them so they would never leave him. Meanwhile, Maineth, the spirit of the Mechonis, helped her creations, the Machina, build a great civilization, and was close with Egil and his sister, Vanea. At first, the peoples of both worlds coexisted, with Egil becoming close friends with Arglus, a giant who dreamed of life beyond the Bionis and Mechonis. In the end, Zanza had established a cycle, in which he would continuously destroy the life he created and renew the world in order to sustain himself and prevent his creations from leaving. And he saw Maneth and the Machina as a threat to his new order. So he possessed Arglus through the Monado, a weapon of world-shaking potential which housed Zanza's spirit and attacked the Mechonis. Both Maneth and Zanza were left too weak to continue, but life on both worlds were nearly extinct. While Zanza/Arglus was sealed away by the people of the Mechonis as a part of some grand strategy, Maneth's spirit seemingly vanished, leaving only Egil and the remaining Machina. Most of the Machina wanted to move on with their lives, but Egil refused to forget or forgive. Instead, Egil took control of the Mechonis and plotted his vengeance on Zanza. How does one take revenge on a titanic being like him? Simple. Reduce his fuel supply. To facilitate this, Egil created the Mechon, thousands of robotic servants that he would send in endless waves to annihilate the life on the Bionis. And he'd almost succeed, if not for the Monado finding its way to Dunban, who used it to just barely beat back the Mechon. However, undeterred, Egil persisted and created a new version of the Mechon, the Faced Mechon. Human beings, or rather Homs as they're called in this world, merged inexorably with machine to exploit a defense mechanism in the Monado to prevent it from hurting them. Of course, Egil didn't account for a plucky blonde kid named Shulk being the vessel of Zanza's true spirit that his disciple Dixon raised to have a fascination with machines, and by extension the Monado, and who would pick up the Monado and unlock its true power that undid aforementioned defense mechanisms by freeing the sealed Zanza Arglus to lead a war against the Mechon all the way to Egil himself. Honestly, that's on him. How could he not see it coming? Incredibly abridged JRPG story aside, Egil remained remarkably level-headed despite repeated setbacks, even taking on Shulk himself in his own Mechon armor Yaldabaoth, along with a special machine to cancel out and disable the Monado. Man, he really is ready for everything, isn't he? He goes even further by eventually piloting the Mechonis himself, threatening all life on Bionis against the wishes of Maneth, who has resurfaced and remains housed in the body of Fiora. However, it is only after being defeated and spared by Shulk, who wants to end the cycle of violence, that he considers a different path. Now, not to spoil anything, but things go south real fast, and Egil ultimately sacrifices his life to save the heroes and ensure Zanza's defeat. Despite the sheer scale of his mechanical prowess, there are some drawbacks. Egil hardly has much of a focus on any sort of technical knowledge. We can assume he has plenty based off the fact that he created the many types of Mechon, but it's hardly a focus of his character. Besides that, in combat, he's largely seen in a Mechon suit. There's a stark difference between being an artificer and being a mech pilot. There also isn't much talk about him being an inventor. For all we know, he just found some old assembly lines and just turned them on. Now, I doubt that based off his involvement with the Faced Mechon and elsewhere, but it does bear mentioning. What little we see of him outside the suit is impressive, showing him controlling Mechon at will and even molding the metal of the Mechonis as a part of his attacks. Still, it's a very short-lived showing. That said, I could see an argument for Egil going up to number 3 or even number 2. But regardless, if he is the gatekeeper of the top 3, then it tells you how highly I think of the bronze, silver, and gold spots.
Your blade. It did not come deep enough.
Nicole, Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Like I said, he was originally on this list at number 9, but Egil rewrote half the script. Still, a respectable example. Anna Bray, Destiny 2. Hunter, scientist, and friend of a system-spanning supercomputer that holds the blueprints and means to develop some of the most powerful weapons in the universe. Doesn't get to show a lot of that off, though. Cait Sith, Final Fantasy VII. Really a robotic avatar controlled by a high-ranking member of the Shinra Company, although many of his abilities aren't super congruent with that. During this countdown, you've likely noticed a continuous problem for some of these characters. They either don't quite match the abilities of an artificer, they lack the thematic ties of one, or any possible artificer-like abilities or knowledge they do have is not actually shown. Luckily, here in the top 3, we are now rid of that problem, as these 3 mechanical maestros perfectly fit every aspect of the class, and each in their own unique ways. While our number 1 perfectly matches the D&D class's ideas of a mechanically minded individual performing magic with technology, number 2 and 3 also fit other niches and aspects of the class. For instance, number 3, who despite not technically using magic of any kind, performs just as many feats of miraculous wonder through the act and dedication of the craft, which, as mentioned before, also fits one of the interpretations of the class. To find this craftsman, we look to Triangle Strategy and the army blacksmith, Jens. Jens, yes, that's how you pronounce it, is the young blacksmith working for the army of House Wolfort, and acts initially as just a merchant in the encampment. In the encampment, he is the blacksmith who boosts the weapons of your various units and allows them to unlock new stat bonuses and abilities. However, upon achieving a certain amount of conviction points across the 3 stats, you will get a scene where he and Serenoa come upon a Wolfort soldier. Said soldier has been killed, and his blade, the blade Jens forged for him, snapped in 2. Jens laments his own failed handiwork and realizes that he had never actually seen the end result of the weapons he made. Resolved to become a better smith by actually engaging battle himself to learn what the perfect weapon takes, Jens joins as a playable unit. In battle, Yen comes with a wide variety of traps, debilitation abilities, and even constructions like ladders to improve the mobility of the entire army. For his most powerful ability, Jens can create an automatic ballista that will consistently do damage to any enemies that get into range, even on the enemy's turn, until destroyed. Realistically, just putting it down near where the enemy is coming from means that every time they move, they also get shot. But smart placement can really capitalize on this ability's range and reactionary attacks. In fact, Jens is a very technical unit in Triangle Strategy, requiring plenty of forethought on how you use him. Pairing him with a unit like Quahog can get him around the map quickly, remarkably boosting his effectiveness since now he can set up his constructions across a wider range. As a character, Jens gets a bit more time to shine than your average non-main character unit, since he's an encampment merchant like Lionel and Hasabara. Therefore, he gets to show up more regularly. In those and his own story, it paints the picture of a young man struggling with the reality of war and his original lack of preparedness. Recalling a moment in the past where he made an oath to be the greatest craftsman ever, only for those hopes to be dashed when the war began and sent him away from his place of study. Despite this, he finds something of a mentor in the main character, Serenoa, who demonstrates a different kind of strength that goes beyond any weapon and further inspires Jens to keep fighting and smithing, to bring a speedy end to the war. As I hope I made clear, Jens falls nicely into all the things I like in an artificer. Dedication to a craft, how his abilities function mechanically and in relation to said craftsmanship, and the mentality of an artificer as a craftsman or inventor. If Jens was a more prominent character, he easily would have topped this list, but for where things stand, he has taken a respectable place amongst my favorite artificers.
That is what will end this war. You, my lord, and the unmatched weapons you carry within you.
A second type of artificer is the sci-fi type, which I covered between Parvati and Faustinius. Rather than outright performing magic, they're engineers or hackers that master the technologies of their world and use it in a way that might as well be magic to people like us. Within these sci-fi settings, they rarely take frontline fighting positions, but their unique skills almost always become essential. And for this list, and for my number 2, we look to yet another BioWare game in the world of Mass Effect, to Admiral Tali'Zorah Vas Normandy. Tali was one of 2 real options for this slot, the other being Legion, the Geth. However, Legion is with us for a relatively short period of time, only joining the team in the second game and only in the last third. It gets a larger part to play in the third game, but Tali is present and active through all 3. A member of the Quarian race, Tali and her people are outcasts, refugees forced to live in a massive fleet of ships after being cast out of their homeworld by the Geth, the AI servants they created that eventually developed sentience. Gee, like we haven't seen that story before. Ever since, the Quarians had to adapt to a life as interstellar nomads, and part of that involves their suits, which protect their comparatively weaker immune system from the germs of the rest of the galaxy. With all that in mind, is it any wonder that the entire species is made up of excellent engineers, technicians, and inventors? And among them is Tali Zora, a general all-rounder in the field of machine work who we meet in the first Mass Effect. From then on, she's a squad mate in all 3 games, sharing the honor exclusively with Garrus Vakarian, another fan favorite. She's a tech-based support class that can stand her ground at close range, while distracting with her combat drone, lovingly named Chitika. She also has hacking abilities, and can burn through enemy shields like paper with energy drain. In Mass Effect 3, her hacking ability becomes the sabotage ability, and affects weapons as well as machines, and she gets the defense drone as a counterpart to the combat drone. As long as you don't let her get swarmed or pinned, then she can just as easily keep enemy fire off you. All with a shotgun on her hip and a lovable streak that endears her to pretty much everyone. Well, almost everyone. Is it any surprise she's one of the most popular romance options? Regardless of whether you do romance her, Tali's story is deeply defined by the struggles of her people and their exile, as well as the deep-seated grudge they hold for the Geth they created, tried to destroy, and then got beaten by. Though she tends to take a backseat in the first game, her relationship with Legion and the Geth as a whole becomes much more pronounced throughout 2 and 3, with her and Legion serving as representatives for a crucial decision in Mass Effect 3 that is impacted by decisions in Mass Effect 2, the ultimate fate of the Quarians and the Geth. Both Tali and Legion naturally rally behind what's best for their own people, but if you can convince Tali to set aside her people's past for the Geth, then she can become a voice of peace and moderation amongst the Quarians, so that when the big moment of Mass Effect 3 comes and you must decide between the Quarians and the Geth, a third option may just make itself known. And if you do manage that, then, well, Tali and her people may finally be able to go home.
Right now, I have this.
Years ago, when I first thought up the idea for this list, there was one character I knew would be on it. One character that has, slowly but surely, risen up through the list to sit at the very top as my vision for the pinnacle of an artificer within video games. A character that is so unexpectedly appropriate for the title, but checks every box regardless, fitting both the fantasy and sci-fi attributes of an artificer, valuing intellect and emotion in equal measure, and using technology as a means to perform seemingly magical feats. Drawn from the annals of Destiny lore and into the game as a character that is beloved by almost everyone, I give to you my personal favorite character from Destiny 2 and my choice for the #1 artificer in all of video games, Mithrax of House Light. Born deep in space during the long voyage of the Eliksni, who fled their homeworld after the godlike traveler abandoned them to the oncoming Black Fleet, Mithrax has only ever known the need to survive. His mother, Enax, was a pirate who stooped to stealing and violence in order to survive, forsaking the old ways of her people and teaching her son the same. During this time, Mithrax would have 2 adopted brothers in Rakis and Civix, who were pawned off on his house's ship by Aramis. Remember that name. Rakis and Civix would protect Mithrax's ether supply, a vital resource needed for Eliksni to survive, solidifying their brotherly bond. A bond that would be shattered when Mithrax would take up the life of piracy himself, after his mother discovered artifacts of darkness, which were the severed pieces of Nezarec, an ancient entity of darkness. Mithrax would eventually come into possession of one of these pieces and view it as a token of power. But said power made him brutal and merciless. He would end up marooning his brothers on an asteroid out of paranoia. In time, Mithrax would be forced back to the life of a traditional Eliksni and fight against the Awoken, only to be captured. During this time, and after a failed attempt to take his own life to restore his honor, Mithrax would make an alliance with Sior Ido, the right-hand woman of the Queen of the Awoken, Mara. Well, I mean, she was a lot more than just the right hand of Mara, if you catch my drift, but this is Mithrax's story. While working with them, Mithrax would find an Eliksni hatchling, barely born and without a family, and he would adopt her as his own daughter, Ido, in honor of his new friend. Years would pass and Mithrax would work to try and uplift his people from where they were, even crossing paths with the player character and other Guardians, resulting in temporary alliances and eventually founding the House of Light, dedicated to putting the past away and aiding humanity in service of the Traveler who they still worship. Mithrax would be referenced from time to time, usually under his mispronounced name Mithrax, but it wouldn't be until the season of the Splicer that we'd properly get to know him. Speaking of, what is a Splicer? Well, as the name suggests, a Splicer's purpose to the Eliksni is to splice and augment members of their house with technology, cybernetics, bioengineering, and just about any other mad scientist thing you can think of. As for Mithrax, he might just be one of the best splicers I've ever seen, able to effortlessly open a hole into the Vex network. The Vex being a time-traveling hive mind of robots that can predict events tens of thousands of years in advance. And not just open holes, but actively manipulate the network to aid the Guardians within it. In the season of the Splicer, Mithrax would directly help the last city of humanity overcome the endless night cast over them by opening up the way for Guardians to scour the Vex network. All throughout this, he would persist in teaching his people to stand with humanity, to resist the old bitterness of humanity towards the Eliksni, and to find a place next to some of his people's oldest enemies, like Saint 14. Not only does he amplify his Splicer Gauntlet, his instrument for all this, with Vex technology, but he has taught many more Splicers in House Light that continue to help humanity in their war against the darkness. In the past, he was clever enough to trick our ghost and trap us, outmaneuver Aramis, who had begun to serve the darkness over and over again, and even transformed pure darkness from the same relics that his mother once found, into a cure that would wake the long comatose Osiris from his slumber. And now, with the Final Shape DLC out, he stands beside us as an ally and equal against the greatest threat our existence has ever seen. He also has his own small story, and we help him get some closure for the past, but I'll leave that one for another day, perhaps. Mithrax, whatever you call him, he and his skill with a blade and machine, as well as his ability to inspire hope in a people long thought fallen, will no doubt lead them alongside humanity into the future.
How do you know we can trust them? I don't. What the light provides.
Thank you, as always, for watching all the way here. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as they say. Tell me what artificers you think are deserving of being mentioned, and hey, I'm working on videos for all the D&D classes, so suggest characters for any of those lists to come too. And for any of you worried, no, I'm not going to stop any of the other video types either. I just like countdowns. I'm glad I was able to finally start working on a project like this, and I hope you will all hang around with me all the way through. Until then, I am the Hearth Guy, and I will see you all next time, around the hearth.